I need to talk to you guys as we're hitting the 150-day mark of Donald Trump's presidency about the state of negotiations. And I wanted to start with the G7 because Donald Trump went to the G7 where Zelensky was supposed to be, and he was going to have a meeting with Zelensky. He was going to have a meeting with all of these different world leaders, and then he only stayed there for a day, and then he left early. Now, Emmanuel Macron said, covering for him, oh, he's leaving because he wants to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. And then Trump said, no, that's not true. Nope. What ceasefire? I didn't say that. And so it's probably that he headed down to the Situation Room in order to, prepare the scenarios where they would be dropping B-2 bombers on Iranian atomic facilities. But point is, they only had the G7 for a single day. So there was no coordination of Ukraine aid, no coordination of sanctions. And this comes after not only his pre-inauguration deadline was passed, his 24-hour deadline was passed, his 100-day deadline was passed, but after his third, not his first, not his second, but his third 2-week deadline was just ran out over the weekend. So what did he do on the one day that he was at the G7? Well, he talked, he had meetings, some PR stuff. And what did he talk about? Well, he said that if Russia was in the G7, which at the time was the G8, when Russia was still in the G7, which was the G8 when they were in it, that there wouldn't have been a war. As in referencing a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then he blamed Justin Trudeau for it. Let's listen.
President Donald Trump is meeting right now with Canadian Prime Minister Mark. U.S. President Donald Trump is meeting right now with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Alberta. This video is actually from moments ago. Let's listen in.
Go ahead, sir. All right, thank you. Mr. President, welcome to Canada. Thank you. It's a great honor. Happy birthday. A few days short. A little bit. A few days short, but didn't have a chance to see you on the day. Happy birthday to the U.S. military as well, 250th, and this is the 50th birthday, if you will, of the G7. This marks the 50th birthday of the G7, and the G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership, and your personal leadership of the United States, many issues. Geopolitics, economic, technology, and working hand in hand with the United States, Canada and the United States, and the other G7 partners with your leadership. I'm very much looking forward to the meeting. I'm grateful to have you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it, and we've developed a very good relationship, and we're going to be talking about trade and many other things. And we have a whole group of people.
We have a betting pool on how quick this takes to derail, but I will spoil it and tell you very quickly.
Traders and some other people. I see my top economy people. But we have a very talented group of people, and you do too, and I know they work together very well. I look forward to that. The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in, and I would say that was a mistake, because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in. And you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago. But it didn't work out that way. But it used to be the G8.
Before I even comment on what he just said about the G7, he can't keep saying, like, oh, there wouldn't have been a war if I was president. Prevent one of the wars that are starting right now, and then maybe I'll believe you. Come on, man.
And now it's, I guess, what's that, 8 years ago, it switched over. They threw Russia out, which I claimed was a very big mistake. Even though I wasn't in politics then, I was very loud about it. It was a mistake in that you spend so much time talking about Russia, and he's no longer at the table. So it makes life more complicated. But you wouldn't have had the war. Other than that, I think we're going to accomplish a lot. And I expect to. And I think our primary focus will be trade, and trade with Canada. And I'm sure we can work something out.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so much.
So Donald Trump opened the G7 while talking to Canada, which was located in Canada, by attacking Justin Trudeau for kicking Russia out of the G8, making it the G7, starting, helping to start this war. Now, let's get the simple thing out of the way. Justin Trudeau wasn't prime minister at the time. I believe it was Mark or whatever. It was a different prime minister in 2016. It was a different guy. So just getting that out of the way. I don't know. I think he's just blaming Justin Trudeau because he's the only Canadian politician he knows, maybe. Either way, that's wrong. But here's the other thing. Russia was kicked out of the G7, which made it the G7, not the G8, because they invaded Ukraine. The war started, and in response to that, they were kicked out of the G8, indicating that obviously having Russia at the table for the G8 was not enough to stop them from invading, because they invaded anyway while being in the G8. So the war did start without them. I mean, the war started with them in the G8, and I don't see how, like, what it doesn't. So he got the leader wrong. He got the timeline wrong. Now, if I was to try to stretch my way around, bend myself like a stretchy man and say, okay, well, maybe he means the full-scale invasion, and that if we would have kept, I mean, maybe, yeah, he got the leader wrong, but maybe if we would have kept Russia in the G8 up until 2022, then it could have been used as a platform to stop them from invading Ukraine again. So they'll invade Ukraine once while in the G8, but they wouldn't do it twice. They wouldn't do it twice. Number one, that's silly on its face. If they're willing to do it once, why wouldn't they be willing to do it twice? And number two, the issue at hand is a platform by which to communicate with the Russians. There are back channels. There were back channels that Lloyd Austin had open between them and the Russian armed forces. There are a ton of different business people that have been used as intermediaries during the Biden administration and could be used as intermediaries now. There's, of course, the United Nations. There's nation states like Oman that could be as an intermediary. The idea that the G8 was the only option when it didn't work the first time in preventing an invasion is just silly. But he says this so confidently. He says this so absurdly. And you can see Mark Carney kind of twitch a little bit. What I saw was like this moving of the mouth as his tongue dances around his mouth. And he tries to distract himself when he A, blames Justin Trudeau, who wasn't prime minister at the time, and then B, says if they were in the G8, it might have not stopped the first invasion, but it totally would have stopped the second one. It's ridiculous. And of course, his recommittal to, if I was president, the world would be all flowers and gumdrops. So this is the type of signal that Trump is putting out on the eve of 150 days of failed negotiations, which is, well, if we just talked a little bit more with them inside the G8, giving them what consequence for invading Ukraine? I mean, what should we have done when they invaded Ukraine in 2014? Nothing? My critique of it is that we didn't do enough. But let's keep going, because MERS did eventually push back against this, not to Donald Trump's face, of course. None of them would do this to his face. They're all scared that they're going to scare him off. They're doing everything they can to soothe him, to pat him on the head, to treat him with kid gloves and pillow fists, because if they piss off Trump, he might have some baby rage and then completely disengage. And so only when it was all done, MERS said, well, you know, keeping Russia in the G7 wouldn't have worked. In fact, and I quote, "We are not sitting here in this format with warlords and not with war criminals. This is why Putin has no place at this table." So it seems that the rest of Europe probably doesn't agree with him, because maybe they know the history, maybe they remember who the Canadian Prime Minister was, maybe they understand that they could have used any other number of avenues to negotiate. But this is not the first time Trump has said this. This is something that Trump has continued to say over and over and over again. So this is a long-standing Trumpian position. Long-standing position. And these type of diplomatic face plants are having their impact. No confidence. Trump will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. Look at this data from Pew Research Center. 61% of Japanese think Trump will not do the right thing. 62% of British, 68 Italian, 77 Canadian, 78 French, and 81% German. Maybe that's why it was the German Prime Minister Merz who ended up standing up. And ever since their coalition government has come into place, their polling has started to go in the right direction for the CDU, upwards. No confidence the U.S. will do the right thing. During the Biden administration, it was 51%. During Trump now, it was a jump of 22 points to 73%. By the way, this is a side talk, but Canadians on reducing reliance on the United States, 91% want to trade with the United States less. There's a certain amount of isolation that is being self-imposed here. But let me go forward, because that's just what Donald Trump is saying. What is Donald Trump's defense secretary saying when asked basic questions about the war? For example, who is the aggressor in the Russia-Ukraine war? Who aggressed? Who started the war? The last administration said it clearly. It was Russia. They invaded. Everybody in the Congress and Senate, even if they disagree, almost all of them are going to say, yeah, of course, it was the Russians. They started the war. They invaded. Well, here is our very strong, hip-shooting cowboy Secretary of Defense from Fox News, the tough guy. When he's asked by this old man, Mitch McConnell, listen to what he says.
Probably won't surprise you, but I'm going to start with Ukraine. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions, but I don't want you to linger on any one of them, but answer the series of questions in one answer. Number one, who's the aggressor and who's the victim in the conflict?
Russia's the aggressor.
Which side do you want to win?
As we've said time and time again, this president is committed to peace in that conflict. Ultimately, peace serves our national interests, and we think the interest of both parties, even if that outcome will not be preferable to many in this room and many in our country.
Which side is President Xi pulling for?
Well, as was stated by both of you, we obviously understand, unfortunately, under this administration and the policy, under the previous administration and the policies they pursued, it has driven Russia and China closer together. So there's no doubt that China would prefer that Vladimir Putin have a good outcome. But it would also...
Is this administration, and this is the thing, because the administration has been looking at normalization with goo-goo eyes and pursuing it even without a settlement to the war so far. Is this administration deluded enough to believe that we're going to separate the Russians and the Chinese from reliance on each other? That they're not going to use each other as platforms, economic or otherwise?
Also prefer a prolonged conflict that would keep us and other countries tied down and incapable of paying attention to the malign influence of China elsewhere.
You mean the prolonged conflict that has been 150 days ongoing since you guys got inaugurated? Like when they say, oh, we don't want a prolonged conflict. The conflict is here, dude. It's already here. It's like, yeah, wish upon a star.
One thing I'm sure we agree on is we don't want a headline at the end of this conflict that says Russia wins and America loses. And given the fact that all of our adversaries are communicating with each other, that's extremely important if we're going to continue to play the role in the world that the vast majority of members of Congress think we should still play, particularly now that our adversaries are more significant than they have been since the Berlin Wall came down.
So, as the Trump administration talks, not only about, 2 more weeks, just endlessly pushing it down and down and down and down. I don't know if you guys saw this, in case you still had any confusion, but Donald Trump was asked again whether or not new sanctions were going to be implemented after 150 days of failed negotiations. After every single line he's drawn in the sand has been crossed by the Russians, and his deals have been slapped down, and he has had the country and himself disrespected again and again and again. He has once again asked President Trump, will you do anything? Or will you just step out of the way and allow sanctions to go into place? The answer to that is no. U.S. President Trump said he is delaying new sanctions against Russia as he waits for a possible agreement to end the war against Ukraine. I'm waiting to see if an agreement is signed. There will be no agreement signed. I just got back from the Konstantinivka front. It is more violent than it has ever been. The front line smells like death. There have been more drone strikes, more missile strikes than at any point in the war. Last night, my apartment was shaken multiple times from drone and ballistic missile strikes. My area was very violent. 14 dead, over 100 injured. This war is escalating. They're escalating their attacks on the Sumy. They're escalating their attacks on the Kharkiv. They're escalating their attacks on the Pokrovsk axis. They're escalating their attacks towards Konstantinivka, as I saw firsthand. As we were trying to evacuate the elderly and deliver water in the area, the bombing was constant, and it was near where the civilians were. And it was putting them in great danger, as well as continuing to perpetuate the war. The Russians have used these negotiations as nothing more but a means as which to delay American action. And Donald Trump has served that role perfectly well. Perfectly well. I mean, the Russians say that they still will not accept anything but Ukraine's demilitarization. The Russians, I mean, let me read you this headline. Let me bring this one out for you. Russia to demand Ukraine destroy Western weapons to end the war. They demand Zaporizhia, a city of 700,000 that they haven't even been able to touch, that they get that out with, they get it without a fight. They've demanded a river crossing across the Kherson, into Kherson, reconquering the city that they were pushed out of. The city where the human safari is ongoing, where civilians are hunted, right? They or demand the rest of Luhansk, demand the rest of Donetsk, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Konstantinivka, Pokrovsk, the little bit of Chasiv Yar on Tourette's that continues to hold on despite everything. They get all of that, no NATO membership, no alliances, make Russian the official state language, and Ukraine has to blow up the weapons they could use to defend themselves next time if the Russians so choose that Ukraine still doesn't exist, which is what the government believes. It's their revanchist ID, their foundation. And so this is what we're waiting on? The Russians have sent no signal that they're willing to compromise. Aid cuts to Ukraine. Intelligence cuts to Ukraine. The mineral deal was signed. Unconditional ceasefire was signed. A civilian ceasefire was agreed to. It was immediately violated, and the Russians denied they ever signed it. The energy ceasefire was agreed to, immediately violated it, and the Ukrainians are saying right now that the Russians could be preparing for new strikes on Ukraine's civilian electrical infrastructure, as Ukraine has held back from strikes on Russian oil refineries that help prop up the war economy that they're holding back on because Trump asked them. Just like Trump asked them to agree to an unconditional ceasefire, they did turn to the Russians, and that I will bring pressure down upon them. I'll bring sanctions. I'll bring aid to the Ukrainians. If they don't come to the table and talk, they said, we're not going to come to the table and talk. The one time they suggested they might when it comes to Istanbul, Putin then chickened out. Zelensky called his bluff, and it was clear to all the world. And even the nation states in the Middle East, like Gulf states that came to Ukraine and wanted them to negotiate more, and like, come on, be a little nice. They've all shut up. All the other countries of the world that were kind of suspicious if Ukraine really wanted peace, they've all got quiet. They found out very quickly, damn, it really is the Russians. It was the Russians who started this, and it's the Russians who perpetuate this. It's just Donald Trump. It's just him who is waiting for a star to pass, for him to wish upon it, and then for gumdrops and flowers and lollipops to rain from the sky, and the war is over. But in the meantime, what rains from the sky is death. Is death. And we can see this all across Kyiv, not only from last night, but at 5 a.m. on the 14th, 4 days ago, the World Central Kitchen office in Zaporizhia was bombed by a Russian drone. Their warehouse where they supply food to locals and try to get food to those who are starving. When this happened in Gaza, it was an international story. It was an international story when the World Central Kitchen convoys, when their aid workers got hit, and it was a horrible tragedy, and it deserved that attention. This didn't barely get a headline. You guys remember this segment on CNN? You guys remember this segment on MSNBC? You remember this segment on Fox, OAN, Newsmax, New York Post, Washington Post, New York Times, anywhere? I don't remember that headline. It was just a blip on the radar. But this type of behavior is happening every single day. The Europeans recognize this. The EU has pushed for new sanctions to target Russian energy and banks, cutting off the last Russian banks from the SWIFT system and trying to target the Russian shadow fleet. Is it enough? No. Is it more? Yes, which is still more that we're getting from the United States. It was Trump saying, you know what, if Putin doesn't agree to this next deadline, we're gonna do something. And Europe was like, yahoo, yes, we're on board. That deadline was crossed. America did nothing, and that offset Europe. They didn't know what to do. They were ready to coordinate something with the United States, but then the United States never came. Signed a check that could not be cashed. And at the same time that this is happening, not only is more pressure not being laid upon the Russians, some pressure is being removed. We've already talked before about Donald Trump threatening to not only sanction Russia, but also Ukraine. We've already talked before in a whole other segment while I was in Kramatorsk. We did a live recording, and a recording, not a live stream, and I released that on the second channel, talking about how Lindsey Graham's sanction bill is currently being approached by the Trump administration from one perspective, which is how can we water it down? How can we make it so the sanctions have less impact? After Trump banged his chest on the campaign trail about secondary sanctions, now that the time has come for him to actually implement secondary sanctions, and Congress is willing to do the hard work for him, he has instead stood in the way of further action. But it doesn't stop there. The Trump administration is redirecting 20,000 anti-drone missiles that are meant to knock out the Shaheeds and other drones that Russia is producing en masse out of the sky that are being redirected to the Middle East to support our forces there. Maybe if this was another world and Trump was adding more aid and Trump was adding more pressure, Trump was passing through these sanctions, maybe you could justify this through the tensions rising over there. But when all you get is aid cuts and intelligence cuts, and you better sign the mineral deal or you're going to pay. And then you have these types of cuts for anti-drone missiles that were already approved for Ukraine by the last administration. What is the signal that this sends? It certainly doesn't tell the Russians that they have to rush to the negotiating table. And what is it exactly that Donald Trump put forward to be the ultimate guarantor of peace if somehow his deal works? If somehow this clusterfuck of nonsense that he has put forward as a diplomatic strategy actually ends up working in that 24-hour promise, while way off from being delivered on now, ends up seeing peace in 160, 170 days. Well, Trump says no NATO membership, despite what our recent debate guest KOE might have said. Trump said no NATO membership. And so if there's no NATO membership, how are you going to dissuade the Russians, even if they agreed to your ceasefire, to not invade again? Especially if they're continuing to make maximalist demands like, hey, Ukraine, blow up all the weapons you used to stop us from conquering Kyiv. That was really mean of you. Next time we'd like to conquer Kyiv. He said, well, this mineral deal is actually a security guarantee for Ukraine. Not because we're going to come and do anything if you get invaded again. No. But this mineral deal will make it so the Russians won't invade again because they would not dare invade a country and bomb American businesses. Now, if you're not willing to say you're going to put American troops on the ground in response to the invasion, it's going to be pretty hard for the Russians to believe that you care enough about those businesses to actually do something. So if you're dodging a security guarantee with a business deal, they're not going to think that the business deal is a sufficient replacement for security guarantee. But even if we reach that conclusion, okay, fine. Russia blew up Boeing's office in Kyiv, an American business, 3 days ago. 3 days ago. An American business was bombed. Last night, an American citizen was killed. Do you want to know what type of response that got? Outside of the obvious message of, wow, it looks like that strategy that Trump put forward of just a business deal bringing about peace. Here was the official State Department reaction to the death of a U.S. citizen yesterday in Ukraine.
Sure. Two questions. Okay. In your topper, you also recognize American diplomats serving in Ukraine and Israel who spent another night in the bunker.
Yes.
But one of American citizens happened to be killed by the Russians last night in Ukraine. Do you have any comment on will the U.S. government act to protect American citizens in Ukraine?
Yes, we are aware of last night's attack on Kyiv, which resulted in numerous casualties, including the tragic death of a U.S. citizen. We condemn those strikes and extend our deepest condolences to the victims and to the families of all those affected. The president, in the recent past, has made his thoughts clear about striking the civilian areas in that regard. And just to reiterate again, which is at the thread throughout all of the work that we do, is the department has no higher priority than the safety and security of U.S. citizens abroad, and we can confirm the death of a U.S. citizen in Ukraine, and we stand ready to provide all possible consular assistance. And out of respect to the family during this obviously horrible time, we have no further details to offer in that regard.
Thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers. What does this tell them? You can kill American citizens, you can blow up American businesses in Ukraine. They ain't gonna do anything. They ain't gonna do squat. And that is supposed to be the security guarantee that stops the Russians from invading again? I have never seen such limp-wristed behavior from the American administration in the reaction to the death of our own citizens. The only other comparison I can think of is any U.S. citizen that dies in Gaza, which doesn't even bear mentioning on the TV. The only indication that I have gotten from the last few days of any action whatsoever has been that the Russians are claiming, good night, Wolf, hope you're doing well, that the U.S. has canceled talks with Russia on restoring diplomatic relations, that they were going to have a meeting to make visa requirements easier and make it so, you know, it's easier for Russia and America to do business so our money can funnel into their war machine. Apparently, a single meeting was canceled. Listen to this. The U.S. has canceled the next round of talks with Russia on restoring diplomatic relations. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, claimed on June 16th. So this is a Russian claim. Zarkova's statement came days after the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Alexander Darachev, announced that the delegation from both countries were expected to meet in Moscow in the near future. The planned talks were supposed to be part of the discussions between the U.S. and Russia that focused on peace efforts in Ukraine and the resumption of bilateral ties. According to Zarkovka, the upcoming round was intended to eliminate irritants, that's one way to describe the largest war in Europe since World War II, and help normalize the operations of both nations' diplomatic missions. We hope that the pause taken by the U.S. will not become too long. Washington has yet to comment on Zarkovka's claim. And as this beating around the bush continues, this is the type of stuff that Kyiv's under. Look at this. By the way, a lot of people talk about whether or not a strike was meant for a civilian area or if it was intercepted. Here is a Russian Shahed heading straight into a civilian building with zero interception. That straight into it. It wasn't shot down and then it hit a civilian building. No, its route went straight into it. How else are we supposed to interpret that? Open bombing in civilian areas after the Russians told Trump, civilian ceasefire. We agree to your civilian ceasefire, Mr. Trump. We agree. Immediately violates it, and Trump sits on his hands. This is dereliction of duty. This is destroying American credibility. This doesn't just hurt Ukraine. This hurts the United States. What country in the world is supposed to think that Donald Trump doesn't have a soft spot for Vladimir Putin and the Russians, and that the Russians, if they were to say move into Moldova, move into Georgia, move into Armenia, or hell, maybe even move into a NATO state, there's a certain amount of weakness that it at least begs the question of, is there anything the Russians can do that will derive a response from Vladimir Trump? Here's also a video of Russian cluster bombs. Again, ceasefire in civilian areas. This is a civilian area. These are apartment blocks being bombed by Russian cluster bombs in the Ukrainian capital last night. 427 drones, like 30 ballistic missiles. They feel like they can get away with anything right now. Look at this. And it's not a question of whether that's a cluster bomb. Look at that. That is clearly a cluster bomb. You can see it from the impact. And the mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, he did go to the site of these strikes, and he did show the munitions that were used. So if you want more footage of the cluster bombs, here it is. Here is footage of a family dealing with what everybody, including me and others who live here, have to deal with every night, which is the Russian drones and ballistic missile strikes. Here is them sleeping in their bed with their child, trying to guard him as the bombing gets a little too close. That was caught on a baby monitor. That was caught on a baby monitor. At what point does this not have the United States implicit endorsement? And I'm not even saying that, you know, the United States will openly come out and endorse it. But if at a certain point, if your response is, we condemn, yeah, we condemn, but no action is taken, they at the very least think that, well, the United States doesn't care enough to do anything. Here is a couple who had their child, their older son, I believe he was in his 30s, buried in a building. And they're outside that building waiting to find out if their son's going to be dug out of the rubble from yesterday. And they were dead. And I will not show you the footage of when they found that out, but it was bad. It was very, very bad. And one of the worst things I've seen, this is from PBS, is that the Russians are finally starting to show some movement on the long-standing demand to return Ukrainian traffic and kidnapped kids. And you want to know what their offer is? They'll exchange the children that they trafficked for soldiers that they will then put back in uniform and use to reinvade Ukraine. Talk about a perverse incentive. Kidnap a child, get a fighting age soldier in return. The military logic there works, but what's the type of thing you're incentivizing with that? You're incentivizing the trafficking. You're incentivizing the kidnapping. You're making them know, like, hey, if you take a bunch of Ukrainian children, get them by the busload, and you'll get soldiers by the busload, as the Russians find new volunteers for this war might not be too easy to come by. At the start of 2024, the average age of a Russian volunteer was 40. Mid-2024, it was 45. End of 2024, it was 50. They can use every soldier they can get. And it seems like there is nothing that is beneath them in order to get those soldiers back. Mind you, this is all going on while the Russians are dealing with really devastating losses to continue to advance. UK Defense Intelligence, going off Ukrainian government statistics, of course, and that should be mentioned, are saying that the Russians have lost 1 million men. So they say 250,000 killed, 750,000 wounded. 1 million men. Now let's say it's just half of this number. If it is half of this number, that is still 2 to 3 times larger than every single Soviet casualty, not just Russian casualty, but the entirety of the Soviet sphere from the entirety of Soviet wars post-World War II from 1945 to 1989. All of those casualties, combine them, double it, it's still not half of this number. And it's not getting easier. For all of the pushing forward, it isn't getting easier. The Russians are dealing with more and more and more losses every day. In fact, here is the UK Defense Intelligence graph on it. Don't need to believe it. You can say, hey, they take that number from, who's it, what's it? I don't trust that source. Here's CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the reason I'm showing this isn't to say, look, here is the specific death number that I know for sure is accurate. The Ukrainians and Russians both have incentives to lie about casualty statistics. But what you can see here in this graph is in 2022, the Russians were at a certain tempo for casualties. Then that rose in 2023. Then that tempo rose again in 2024. And then the tempo rose again at the start of 2025. And you can see that every year they start lower and then go higher. And so now we can see that at the start of 2025, they're at the casualty numbers for the end of 2024. And as we know, we're going into the summer months now. Right now it's June, July, August, September. These months are going to be the months of offensive actions for the Russians. And so these casualties are going to continue to increase. And so it'd be one thing if Ukraine couldn't defend itself. But it's not like there's nothing, like there's no device by which Trump could increase the pressure on the Russians. He could allow the sanctions bill, which is in the Senate with 84 co-sponsors. Talk about bipartisan in a 100 member lobby. 100 senators, 84 have signed on. That's veto proof. If Thune and Mike Johnson could get this legislation to the floor, it would pass with flying colors. Veto proof. He could just step out of the way and allow that to happen. He could finally send that aid package he threatened to on the campaign trail, an aid package that hasn't even begun in preliminary discussions on what the Ukrainians would need next. He could sell them the weapons. He could deliver a victory to his base saying, look, I stopped Ukraine screwing us, and I decided that our businesses deserved money. We deserve money. We're making money. When he sells the Saudis $142 billion worth of weapons, he brags about that. Why can't he brag about selling the Ukrainians $15 billion worth of air interceptors to protect their airspace and save lives, instead of giving it to a butcherous king who chops up journalists? But no, that type of diplomacy is just too crazy, too reckless, too much. At some point, if Congress believes that something has to be done, they just have to do it. You can't wait on Trump forever. In fact, take the initiative and then let Trump claim it after. I don't care. I do not care. As long as there's more air interceptors to protect these cities, so I know that there's a little bit more between these kids, their hospitals, their homes, and Russian bombs. I don't care if Trump gets to claim it. I don't care if Trump calls it the Trump aid bill. I don't care if Trump renames the Patriot system the Trump Patriot system. I don't care. Something has to be done because we've had 150 days of inaction and there is no more excuse. And at a certain point, loyalties have to be questioned. Okay, that's enough of that.